The Dragon Rulers debuted in 2013's Lord of the Tachyon Galaxy, and they quickly became some of the most feared cards in the format. This archetype immediately warped the metagame, not only winning multiple YCSs and the NAWCQ, but also the 2013 World Championship. It took multiple ban lists over the course of a year to stop them, and they remained forbidden for almost a decade. However, over the last year, they've slowly been released from their prison in the TCG, OCG, and Master Duel formats. At the time of recording this, Blaster, Redox, and Tempest are all limited in the TCG and the OCG, while Tidal remains banned. In Master Duel, though, every single Dragon Ruler card is completely unrestricted. This led to a ton of players trying to build modern Dragon Ruler decks for the ranked ladder, but many of them realized that the Dragon Rulers hadn't aged all that well. Here's the basics. There are 4 level 7 elemental dragons that can summon themselves from the hand or graveyard by banishing 2 dragons and or monsters that match their element from your hand or graveyard. During your opponent's end phase, if these cards were special summoned, you return them to the hand. When they're banished, you get to search a dragon of the corresponding element from your deck. Notably, these cards can search themselves when they're banished, so you don't even have to play other targets. They also have in-hand utility effects where you can discard them and a matching attribute monster to do some sort of effect. Tidal, Foolish Burials, Tempest searches a dragon, Blaster destroys a card on the field, and Redox Monster Reborns a monster from your graveyard. Additionally, there are 4 baby dragon rulers that can discard themselves and another dragon or elemental monster to summon their larger counterpart right from the deck. Throughout the year that they were released, there were several different eras of dragon ruler strategies depending on the ban list. When they first released, they were at full power, 3 copies of all the babies and 3 copies of the level 7s. This helped them flood the board on turn 1 with powerful monsters like Dracosac or Big Eye, and they had a nearly infinite grind game, especially compared to the other decks in 2013. Basically, the only deck that could compete with this was Spellbooks, another deck that got broken support in Lord of the Tachyon Galaxy. The next Forbidden and Limited list was one of the largest in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and on it they banned all of the baby dragon rulers. Without the baby dragon rulers, it was a lot harder to load up the graveyard with dragons to banish, so this forced dragon ruler players to pivot into builds that focused on Dragon's Ravine. Despite not being as explosive as they once were, this variant of dragon rulers still became the #1 deck in the new format. On the next ban list, they finally limited all of the big dragon rulers, and even that wasn't enough to keep them from competition. The Mythic Dragons and Shadow Specters gave them easy rank 8 access, a Blue Eyes draw engine helped with consistency, and Soul Charge gave them a way to completely overwhelm the opponent. After that, they finally banned all of them, and they stayed there for many years. So why are they back now? On a fundamental level, the Dragon Ruler play patterns aren't as powerful compared to newer strategies. Many archetypes these days have tons of 1 and 2 card combos that get you a ridiculous amount of advantage and follow-up. While the Dragon Rulers were able to outgrind pretty much any strategy back in the day, it's a lot harder to do that against newer themes. Additionally, another issue is that they haven't really printed too many new dragons to search that are good in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, severely restricting their versatility. It was funny watching people try to build a Dragon Ruler deck in Master Duel because they often were putting cards in that were played back in 2013. For example, even 10 years later, people were still putting Flameveil Guard into their deck as one of the better blaster targets, and that just doesn't feel good in 2024. There have been plenty of successful dragon decks released since the Dragon Rulers got banned, but a lot of them focus on light and dark monsters instead of elementals. Some people did try putting the rulers in their Dragon Link deck just as free special summonable dragons, but they ended up not really being as free as people remembered. The thing about the Dragon Rulers is that you don't really want to banish 2 cards out of your hand to summon a Dragon Ruler from your hand, so you either have to load up the graveyard with cards you want to banish or get the Dragon Ruler in the grave through a card effect. And it's not too difficult to do that. Dragon's Ravine is more searchable than ever. There's a link to that can just add it right to your hand, but with collectible card games, you don't really want to just throw cards into your deck because you could theoretically use them. You want to put the best cards available, and for Dragon Link players, the Dragon Rulers weren't the best thing to send off of the Dragon's Ravine anymore. But of course, these cards aren't only designed to work in Dragon decks, they're also supposed to work in elemental strategies for their individual elements. And for what it's worth, at this point, I think it is more likely that these cards end up in different elemental decks than an actual dedicated Dragon Ruler deck, deck, but even in that context, they still often fall short. Let's start with Blaster. You can discard this card and 1 fire monster to the graveyard, then target 1 card on the field, destroy that target. That's not a bad effect necessarily, but it's also not really that exciting by modern standards. And I think right now is a great time to be looking at this card because it is the year of fire decks. Pretty much in every single format, fire decks have taken over, and yet Blaster is nowhere to be found. And these fire decks are capable of getting huge amounts of card advantage on turn 1. So you'd have plenty of cards to discard for the Blaster effect and plenty of cards to banish in the graveyard to keep bringing it back. But if Blaster doesn't help you combo, doesn't really help you go second, and also your deck already has a good grind game, what would even be the point of playing it? I'm not sure what will happen in the future on TCG and OCG ban lists, but I would assume that Blaster won't be limited for too much longer. Next up, we have Tempest, which in all 3 formats was the first unbanned Dragon Ruler. You can discard this card and 1 wind monster to the graveyard, add 1 dragon monster from your deck to your hand. I think on paper this card does look pretty good because it can add any dragon monster to your hand, which obviously has a huge pool of good cards, but the main drawback of this is that you do have to be playing enough wind monsters to consistently activate it. And there are some wind dragon decks. You do have Dragoonity, but that deck already has a lot of searchers, and you have the Armed Dragon Thunder cards that were released around the same time that Tempest got unbanned. Tempest is right at home in that Armed Dragon Thunder deck because you have a ton of effects that trigger if you discard them for Tempest's ability, but that deck sadly wasn't too competitive. Another issue with Tempest that wasn't present during full power Dragon Ruler format is that Tempest loses hard to Ash Blossom, one of Yu-Gi-Oh's most popular hand traps. Ash Blossom is obviously a great all-around card, but it's especially good against things that require discards, like Trade-in, Signet Mining, and Tempest. I feel like Tempest does have potential. The ability to search any dragon monster in the entire game is certainly appealing, but I'm not really sure what it would need to be successful. The Armed Dragon Thunder cards really play with it well, but they're not quite powerful enough to matter, so I think that it would take a much better Wind Dragon deck to actually see play. The next Dragon Ruler that we're going to take a look at is Redox Dragon Ruler of Boulders. You can discard this card and 1 Earth monster to the graveyard, then target 1 monster in your graveyard, special summon that target. This card's kind of interesting because even though you have to discard an Earth monster, you can bring back whatever you want to. It is literally just a Monster Reborn. And that's fine, but Monster Reborn has been unbanned for quite a while and very few decks play it. So having a Monster Reborn on legs that requires a discard doesn't seem that appealing. But even though you don't have to revive an Earth monster, your deck would definitely need enough Earth monsters to be able to discard for Redox consistently, very similar to Tempest with wind monsters. And when you think about it like that, Redox looks really bad compared to the Vernicelfs. The Vernicelfs are basically all Redoxes that also have bonus effects. And I like those cards a lot, but even those haven't seen too much competitive use. They do have different restrictions than Redox, namely that you can only summon Earth monsters for the rest of the turn. But like I said, I think if you are playing Redox, you have to be playing an Earth archetype anyway, so they're probably still better than Redox. Finally, that brings us to Tidal, the Dragon Ruler of Waterfalls. You can discard this card and 1 water monster to the graveyard, send 1 monster from your deck to the graveyard. Once again here, we have an effect that does require a water monster in hand, but can send any monster from your deck. And that does seem okay. You know, it is a Foolish Burial effect. Foolish Burial is a great card. It is still limited, but is it really so powerful that they have to keep it banned in the TCG and OCG? I feel like Master Duel has kind of shown that you don't need to keep it banned. It's at 3 there and no one's playing it. And I think the main reason people aren't playing it is because there aren't too many good water archetypes that really want this type of effect. Originally, people played this card in the Mermail deck because it does trigger the Atlantean effects, but at this point, that strategy has kind of been power crept too, so Tidal doesn't really make a huge difference. And just like Tempest, Ash Blossom is quite good against Tidal. And not that it super matters, but this does have probably the worst targets out of any of the Dragon Ruler banished effects. If you look up all of the dragon water monsters in Master Duel that you could search with this effect, they actually take up less than 1 search window, which is pretty sad. I made a couple videos many years ago talking about some broken combos if these ever came back, things like Fairy Tale Snow banishing 4 Dragon Rulers or Cyframe Lord Omega recycling them every turn, but even combos like those aren't really that powerful compared to what other decks are capable of doing in 2024, and honestly that goes for rogue decks too, not just the top meta. And with all that, you can see why people aren't really playing the Dragon Ruler retailers now that they're unbanned. Now, it's entirely possible that once these cards fully come back to the TCG or OCG, if that ever happens, they will actually be played, but I think it's pretty unlikely without Konami releasing some really good elemental dragon archetype. Like I said, I think if these cards do see play, it will probably be in an elemental strategy, not a dragon strategy, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Let me know though, I am curious if you guys are playing these cards in any of your decks at the moment. I personally haven't found too many decks for them to go into, but maybe you guys have some cool ideas. Thanks so much for watching today's video though. I'll catch you later. Goodbye.